Good evening and welcome. Tonight I'm going to read to you this awesome book called We Visit Singapore. Let's just dive right in. Visit Singapore. Introduction. Southeast Asia is dominated by an archipelago, a stretch of water containing many islands. Lying between the Asian mainland and Australia in the Indian and Pacific Oceans, the East Indian archipelago stretches more than 4,000 miles from east to west and 1,300 miles from north to south. Also known as the Malay Archipelago, it is the largest archipelago in the world and encompasses some 25,000 islands. One of these islands is fairly small. It is about as long as the distance of a marathon race, or 26 miles. Its total area is about 4 times the size of our nation's capital, America, obviously. It has few natural resources, yet it is one of the wealthiest places on Earth, with an urban landscape dominated by skyscrapers and high-rises. This is Singapore. Just 85 miles north of the equator, it consists of one main island surrounded by about 60 smaller islands. Once run by a distant colonial power, Singapore gained its independence in 1957. The country endured the same chaos that followed independence in many other countries. Yet, in a relatively short time, the country stabilized and embarked on a path to modernization which continues today. It's located right there, Singapore. I think I'm going to get pointer pencil to read right here. A little easier for me. Singapore overview. Welcome to Singapore. It may be surprising to learn that 1 out of 3 people living in Singapore is originally from somewhere else. Few other countries on Earth have been as welcoming to immigrants as Singapore. First settled by the Malays who landed from nearby Malaya, Singapore has also been home to Chinese and Indians for centuries. Today it welcomes people from all over the world, many of whom work in local branch offices for large corporations that are based elsewhere, primarily in Europe and the United States. People arriving here from other countries are granted permanent residency so long as they have a job. Although they cannot vote in general elections, permanent residency allows them to receive many of the same benefits, such as low-cost government housing, that are enjoyed by Singapore citizens. Over the past decade, the numbers of native-born Singaporeans have grown by around 1% a year. Its population of permanent residents has risen by 10% during the same period. The shopping district. In Singapore, people are free to worship as they wish. Singaporeans might be Buddhist, Taoist, Muslim, or Christian. They attend services in mosques, temples, or other houses of worship. Yet while religious differences have led to conflicts elsewhere in the world, in Singapore different religions have succeeded in coexisting peacefully. It is important for people from different backgrounds to get along in Singapore. That's because the country is one of the most crowded on Earth, with an average of nearly 19,000 people per square mile. Only Monaco, which is much smaller than Singapore and which has fewer than 40,000 people, has a higher population density. People in Singapore often follow their own traditions. As a result, a typical Singaporean meal might consist of curry from India, dim sum from China, or even fast food from the United States. Muslim women might wear traditional head coverings, or they might dress in modern clothing. Some Chinese people use chopsticks, others don't. Some Singaporeans worry that the lack of a single dominant culture has left the country's young people without an identity. They don't know who they are. In a place where many people routinely work 6 days a week and shopping is almost a competitive sport, some critics say that money is the state religion. A desire for wealth led the country's British colonial rulers to alter the natural landscape. Jungles were torn up to create farmland, and farmland was paved over to create the city center. Because of this loss of habitat, the tigers that once roamed the island have disappeared. As author Gretchen Liu notes, organized tiger hunting became a lucrative sport. Apart from a $100 reward from the government for each tiger head, the flesh could be sold at a tidy sum to Chinese medicine dealers and the skin to a collector. Numerous other species were also eradicated. Despite the damage to the environment, modern Singapore has made an effort to preserve some of its remaining natural areas. It is trying to avoid what has happened in China, where increasing industrialization and a lack of green spaces have led to dangerous pollution in larger cities. Wetland Reserve. Beautiful public gardens have showcased the island's natural beauty ever since the Singapore Botanic Gardens was founded in 1859. The extensive grounds feature sculptures by international artists alongside a marsh garden laden with water lilies, papyrus plants, and a sundial garden. In Jurong Lake, the Chinese and Japanese gardens each occupy their own island. They provide a means of escaping the urban noise and hustle, while offering an opportunity to remember that Singapore was not always filled with people. In 2013, officials applied for UNESCO World Heritage Site status. The Singapore Botanic Gardens fulfills the criteria for World Heritage Site assessment and is a well-loved outdoor area for Singaporeans from all walks of life, said director Nigel Taylor. It is also significant for its interesting history that parallels Singapore's development. In 2015, it became a UNESCO World Heritage Site. For a step back in time, the Bukit Timah Nature Reserve is the only place with vegetation unchanged since the British arrival nearly 2 centuries ago. Comprising some 400 acres on the western edge of Singapore, this rainforest may be over 1 million years old. Several paths guide visitors through the dense brush that is filled with mammals, reptiles, bugs, and birds. Along the northern edge of Singapore, the Sungai Buloh Wetland Preserve contains 321 acres of wetland habitat and mangrove forests, with 75% of Singapore's wildlife species represented. It is best known for serving as a home for more than 140 different types of birds. These include the common redshank and the Pacific golden plover, which migrates all the way from Siberia to Singapore. Located off Singapore's southern coast, Sentosa Island was originally known as Pulau Belakang Mati, which means Island of Death from Behind. While the origins of the name aren't clear, it lived up to its name in World War II when it was a prisoner of war camp. The name was changed in 1972 and means peace and tranquility. Today, up to 5 million visitors each year enjoy its golf courses, sandy beaches, Universal Studios Singapore, and underwater world, with more than 2,500 Asian Pacific marine animals like pink dolphins and sharks. There's a cool map right there. Chinese junk. Chapter 2, Early Visitors. There is little evidence of people living on the island before about 100 CE. One of the first written records dates many centuries later in 1349, when Chinese trader Wang Dayuan described the island. By then it had become known as Temasek, or a place surrounded by water. According to Wang, there were 2 primary settlements, with a total of perhaps 1,000 people. One settlement was Long Yamen, the lair of pirates who preyed on shipping in the area. The other settlement was Banzu, a peaceful port city devoted to trade. Its inhabitants hailed originally from neighboring Malaya and distant China. Settling along terraced hillsides, they were protected behind a wall. From the South China Sea, merchant ships passed the island before navigating the Strait of Malacca. From there, the ships entered the Indian Ocean or traveled to Middle Eastern ports. Outsiders wanted to gain control of the island and its ports because of its location. The island eventually fell to Parameswara, a prince who lived in the Sumatran town of Palembang. Around 1390, he left his home and attacked Singapore. According to island legend, Parameswara gave Singapore its name. He was inspired by seeing what he thought was a lion, since most lions are native to Africa, not Asia. It's likely that he actually saw a tiger. He believed that lions were a sign of good luck. He changed the name of the island from Temasek to Singapura, which meant Lion City. Soon after Temasek's renaming, Parameswara was driven from the island. He did not go far. The former prince traveled north to Malacca on the Malayan Peninsula. he established a kingdom, eventually transforming Singapore into an outpost of his rule. Another traveler from China may have seen Singapore before Wang Dongwan. Around 1292, Marco Polo began his return voyage to his home city of Venice, Italy, after spending many years in China. Sailing through the South China Sea, he stayed for 5 months on the Indonesian island of Sumatra. Besides describing its landscape, unique animals, and people, he became probably the first European to explain what a monsoon was. As Polo described his trip to Sumatra, he noted that it takes a full year to complete the voyage, for only 2 winds blow in these seas, one that wafts them out and one that brings them back. Polo and his crew left Sumatra when the monsoon winds changed direction. Traveling through the Strait of Malacca's narrow passage, he could have seen Singapore from the deck of his ship. If so, he would have been the first European to spot the island. He would not be the last. The Europeans arrive. There's Alfonso de Albuquerque. Across Southeast Asia, a group of islands about 2,000 miles from Singapore, known as the Moluccas, became well known for producing spices, such as cinnamon, nutmeg, and pepper. These spices were shipped to eager buyers in Europe. European countries like England, France, and Spain competed for the fastest trade routes. Though it was smaller and less wealthy than those countries, Portugal took the lead. By the 1500s, Portuguese sailors had landed along both coasts of Africa, the Arabian Peninsula, and the East Indies. Portuguese ships sailed along the Strait of Malacca. In 1511, Malacca, in present-day Malaysia, was attacked by Portuguese forces under the command of Alfonso de Albuquerque. The Malays fought back, and their defense cost many Portuguese lives. The horrific battle was witnessed by Giovanni de Empoli, an Italian who fought with the Europeans, and later described the locals as the most valiant men, well trained in war, and copiously supplied with every type of very good weapon. The Malays' fearsome defense did not deter the Portuguese, however, as they eventually captured the city. Afterwards, Sultan Mahmud Shah, the ruler of the Malaccan kingdom, fled south. He established a new empire called Johor Riau. Spoilers, there we go. Which extended to Singapore. That control ended in 1613 when Portuguese forces burned a trading post that had been established there. However, Portugal was unable to maintain control of its far-flung properties. Their navy was no match for fleets from larger countries like Spain and the Netherlands. Singapore was often attacked by local forces like the Johor Riau and Sumatra's Aka. In 1641, the Dutch drove Portugal out. In 1795, the British took control of Malacca, although the Dutch ruled over the trade routes to China and the East Indies. The British East India Company, or the EIC, wanted to change that. Taking risks and exploring unfamiliar lands may have been in Stamford Raffles' blood. His father was a merchant seaman. Raffles began working for the EIC as a clerk in London in 1795 when he was 14 years old. He began studying the Malay language and culture. He dreamed of traveling to the archipelago. 10 years later, his dream came true. He journeyed there and filled several key positions with the EIC. Soon after his appointment in 1817 as Governor-General of Bengkulu, an EIC post on Sumatra, Raffles had an idea which would change the future of Singapore. If Britain established a base somewhere along the southern tip of the Malay Peninsula, Raffles believed the country could control the strait. Since the fires set by the Portuguese more than 2 centuries earlier, Singapore had been virtually deserted. Yet Raffles saw an opportunity. Later, Raffles would write, "But for my Malay studies, I should hardly have known that such a place existed. Not only the European, but the Indian world was ignorant of it. It is impossible to conceive a place combining more advantages. It is within a week's sail of China, still closer to Siam, in the very heart of the archipelago, or as the Malays call it, it is the navel of the Malay countries." The EIC decided the idea had merit. Raffles began negotiating with Singapore's Temenggung Abdul Rahman, a senior minister for the Sultan of Johor. On February 6, 1819, Rahman signed a treaty with Raffles and the EIC. It allowed Britain to establish a trading post on Singapore in exchange for annual payments to the Sultan. Soon after, Raffles left Singapore with Colonel William Farquhar in charge during his absence. When Raffles returned 3 years later, the island's development had exceeded his expectations. Merchants had arrived from Indonesia, China, and India, with spices, coffee, gold dust, and exotic items like parrots and birds' nests that could be eaten. The population had nearly doubled. Yet in the midst of all the success, Raffles was stunned by the poverty he encountered. Workers lived in slums, crime and disease were rampant. He set about redesigning Singapore. His plans not only changed the island in the 18th century, they helped it become a world power in the 21st. Raffles neighborhoods. If Singapore had any national pastimes, most visitors and locals would agree they are shopping and eating. Whether buying high-end clothing or bargain merchandise, dining at an inexpensive curry restaurant, or enjoying an upscale 5-course meal, the city is a consumer's paradise. Strolling along Orchard Road, with its mile-long stretch of luxury retailers and high-end restaurants, visitors and residents alike can find it difficult to imagine Singapore's humble origins. Once a swampy backwater with deadly tigers and a small population, its sudden success challenged the island's colonial rulers. Today, Orchard Road might resemble New York City's Fifth Avenue, but in the early 1800s it was an area lined with nutmeg plantations and fruit orchards. Residential development arrived later than on other parts of the island. Shop houses replaced farmland. These combination home businesses featured shops on the first floor while the owner and his family lived on the second. Visitors from the United States can easily find familiar stores and restaurants, but adventurous travelers seek out Singapore's ethnic enclaves. These neighborhoods offer an immersion in unfamiliar cultures. They owe their existence to one man, Stamford Raffles. When Raffles returned to Singapore, he was dismayed. Today, the Singapore River neatly divides the city into Chinatown to the south and the Colonial District to the north. Back then, new arrivals from places like China, Arabia, Armenia, and India settled into rundown shacks along the river's banks. During the year Raffles governed Singapore, he turned Forbidden Hill, now Fort Canning Hill, into his base. Another island hill would be leveled and eventually transformed into a commercial district bearing his name, Raffles Place. The fast-growing city was crowded and dirty. The messy sprawl bothered Raffles. He created an alternative when he drew up the town plan of 1822. It designated ethnic areas called kampongs, or village sections, along with government and commercial districts. Despite almost 2 centuries of development and modernization, the kampongs remain in existence. Not far from modern cars racing along Nicole Highway, an ancient culture famous for its customs is nestled within the Kampong Glam Malay Heritage District. In the shadows of the Sultan Mosque, the island's largest Muslim worship center, lies Arab Street. Here Islamic faithful shop for halal, food prepared in accordance with Muslim dietary restrictions, side by side with non-Muslim Singaporeans and tourists drawn by the area's bargains. Travel writer Jennifer Eveland often stops at Haji Textiles for sarongs. These long and colorful pieces of cloth are worn by men and women who either tuck it around their waist or under their arms. This traditional garment, Eveland says, is perfect for traveling as they're lightweight, but can serve you well as a dressy skirt, bedsheet, beach blanket, window shade, bath towel, or whatever you need. When I'm on the road, I can't live without mine. Besides sarongs, shoppers along Arab Street can find antiques, Southeast Asian handicrafts and tablecloths, and quilts from India. Like most shoppers familiar with local customs, Eveland notes that buying more than one item from a store lowers the prices. Haggling, negotiating a price with a shopkeeper, is a time-honored tradition in Singapore. Most locally owned stores encourage it, as do some hotels. Observant Muslims are not allowed to come into contact with alcohol. They can't drink it, and they can't wear it either. This eliminates most store-bought perfume. At Jamal Khazura Aromatics, shoppers buy oil-based, alcohol-free perfumes which imitate the scents of well-known designers. Shoppers can even buy made-to-order perfume for a custom one-of-a-kind scent. Outside the shops, small stalls and stands offer a variety of local goods. Yet the Kampong Glam Malay Heritage District is just one example of Singapore's multicultural commerce. Arab Street's Maruti Textiles offers fabrics from India, and less than a mile away, Little India offers an authentic Indian experience. Its crowded, chaotic streets and the pungent scent of curry seem a world away from the island's sterile business district. Little India preserves tradition for many residents who are far from home. Along Serangoon Road, visitors delight in bright pastel buildings, colorful lights, and the expensive silks hanging from street stalls. With some of Little India's best shopping, Serangoon Road draws both bargain-hunting tourists and the country's many Indian residents. The street's biggest draw is the bustling Mustafa Center. Inside, shoppers enjoy a 2-block-long department store that never closes. It's open 24 hours a day. More modern than the area's smaller shops, it sells many of the same items that are found in malls the world over, like sporting goods, digital cameras, and makeup. With a reputation for variety and reasonable prices, Mustafa Center is very popular with Singaporeans. What truly sets it apart are the authentic Indian goods. As Evelyn notes, the real finds are rows of saris and silk fabrics, 2 floors of jaw-dropping gold jewelry and Indian designs, an entire supermarket packed with spices and packets of instant curries, ready-made Indian-style tie-dye and embroidered casual wear, incense and perfume oils, cotton tapestries and textiles for the home. The list goes on. Away from the noise of shoppers and shopkeepers, a moment of serenity can be enjoyed inside Little India's temples. The Sri Veeramakaliamman temple is dedicated to the worship of the Hindu goddess Kali, who is celebrated for bringing about the death of the ego and ending self-centered thinking. The Sakyamuni Buddha Gaya temple is devoted to its namesake. Here a sitting Buddha is neatly represented by a nearly 50-foot statue. Across Race Cross Road from the Sakyamuni Temple, also known as the Temple of 1,000 Lights, is the Taoist Longsan Temple. Nearly 75% of Singaporeans are Chinese. Sprawling Chinatown reflects their influence. Located near Pearl's Hill City Park, at the southeastern end of the city center, Chinatown overflows with small shops and restaurants which cater to travelers and native Chinese. Although many of the neighborhood shophouses were torn down during the city's modernization in the 1960s and 1970s, today many have been lovingly renovated. Restored shophouses often sell for over $2 million. Pagoda and Terengganu streets are closed to cars. People stroll and spend freely along the boulevard, where everything from Chinese silk robes to labor-intensive Vietnamese lacquerware is available for sale. Considered touristy by locals, the area's goods are often available for less money at the Chinatown complex further down Terengganu Street. For an escape from the noise and commerce, a pair of often photographed temples dominate the Chinatown skyline. Along Talak Ayer Street, the Tan Hokkien Temple is the city's oldest Hokkien temple. Built in 1839, it reflects the traditional southern Chinese architectural style. Probably the most photographed landmark in Chinatown, however, is a temple with an Indian background, the Sri Mariamman Temple, the oldest Hindu temple in the city. The city's well-preserved ethnic neighborhoods like Little India and Chinatown reflect Singapore's rich history of welcoming outsiders. By the early part of the 20th century, Singapore is often described as a success story, yet the island was facing enormous challenges which threatened to eclipse its success. The rise of Singapore. There's a rubber plantation. In the March 1926 issue of National Geographic magazine, a lengthy article on Singapore described the country's progress. From a jungle isle where tigers ate men at night to a magnificent city, 10th among the ports of the world in less than a century, declared one breathless sentence. Through the thick jungle where once led only the elephant paths, wide, level roads have now been built, and the hoarse squawk of the motor horn has drowned the fierce growls of the lurking tiger. More than 100 years after Raffles returned to England, where he died penniless in 1826 at the age of 45, Singapore had become the jewel of the East. It had been built by thousands of immigrants and even prisoners. They arrived on its shores from halfway around the world. Many came to the boomtown dreaming of a better life. Some died in its pursuit. In 1824, under the Anglo-Dutch Treaty, the Dutch withdrew their objections to British occupation of Singapore. In exchange for money and pensions, the Sultan and the Temenggung likewise relinquished control of the island. In 1826, it became part of the Straits Settlements, a British-controlled region which also included Malacca, Ding Ding, and Penang. In 1832, Singapore became the headquarters. By the 1850s, Singapore trade had outgrown the Singapore River Port. Shipping companies financed a larger port at New Harbour. The city attracted more than merchants and workers dreaming of wealth. Singapore also drew large waves of criminals who hoped to get rich. Like the pirates described by Wang Dai-wan, this new generation of thieves attacked from boats. They rowed out of the Philippines and China, assaulting merchant ships before escaping to island caves and coves. These 19th century pirates were so bold that they stole from vessels docked in the harbor, then sold the goods openly along Singapore streets. The Chinese arrived in the hundreds and thousands, quickly overwhelming the native Malays who had struggled on the island for centuries. Amongst Chinese immigrants, secret societies developed. These criminal organizations exploited new arrivals and encouraged downtown riots. Long before the American West, Singapore owned a reputation as a dangerous, lawless area where anything could be had for the right price. The island's small police force was overwhelmed. In 1851, Thomas Dunman was appointed Singapore's first superintendent of police. His goal was to eliminate the lawless, reckless secret societies and reduce other criminal activities. Even as he worked to end the violence of the secret societies and others, immigrant arrivals endured their own horrors. Hoping for a better life in Singapore, they were secreted in ships and packed into cargo holds with little food or water. They became prey for the numerous fatal diseases which stalked so many in the 19th century. Once they arrived, many of them had to pay back the cost of their voyage, usually with at least a year's worth of work. India also used Singapore as a penal colony, sending its prisoners to do the dangerous work of building bridges, constructing roads, and digging in mines. Many prisoners remained in Singapore after gaining their freedom, using the trade they'd learned to earn a living. The opening of the Suez Canal in Egypt in 1869 linked the Mediterranean and Red Seas with South Asia, putting Singapore in a prime location for ships traveling between Europe and Asia. At about the same time, the rise of steamships made ports like Singapore less dependent on trade winds, even as they docked in the city's ports to refuel. The Industrial Revolution transformed the island. This transition from handcrafted to machine-made goods shifted workers from farms to factories. It also fueled tremendous growth in entrepot ports like Singapore. Mined in Malaya, tin was processed in Singaporean smelting plants, then shipped to factories across the world. By the 1900s, Singapore was the largest tin smelter in the world. Another source of prosperity came from the first director of the Singapore Botanic Gardens, English botanist Henry Ridley. He became famous for smuggling rubber plants into Singapore. He worked tirelessly to convince neighboring Malay farmers to grow them. His work earned him nicknames like Mad and Rubber Ridley. Ridley began experimenting with different methods of growing rubber plants and extracting their latex without harming the plants. After disease devastated Malay coffee plantations, the farmers finally gave Ridley's rubber plants a try. They were an immediate success. In an effort to modernize Singapore's port, the Singapore Harbour Board constructed 2 large docks in 1917. Britain also developed military bases in and around Singapore, building a large naval station and several airfields. By the 1920s, Singapore was benefiting enormously from the growing automobile industry. In the United States, Ford Motor Company founder Henry Ford designed an assembly line to speed the production of cars and make them less expensive and therefore more affordable for the average person. Throughout the decade, wages grew while income taxes declined. This helped develop a vibrant Western economy where more people bought cars and other consumer products, many of which relied on metals and rubber processed in Singapore. Everything changed on October 29, 1929. The U.S. stock market crashed, which began what would be known as the Great Depression. It devastated Singapore. Factories shut down. Port businesses declined. Fewer workers were needed. For the first time, the region stopped welcoming immigrants. Instead, thousands of people from India and China were forced to return home. In 1931, Japanese forces invaded Manchuria, a Chinese territory. In Singapore, many of the remaining young Chinese men returned home to fight. Others refused to buy Japanese goods. Despite the Great Depression and increasing hostility from Japan, Singaporeans, European nationals, and other island inhabitants believed better times were just around the corner. They were wrong. On December 7, 1941, Japanese forces attacked the U.S. naval base at Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. At virtually the same time, Japan attacked military installations on the Philippines and dropped bombs on Singapore. Japanese troops also landed in southern Thailand and northern Malaya. Singapore was well protected from the water side. It was ill prepared for an invasion from the landward side. Japanese soldiers, many of them riding bicycles, easily moved south through Malaya. On February 8, 1942, they began attacking Singapore, using small boats to cross the narrow channel to the island. Tomoyuki Yamashita, the Japanese general in charge of the attack, wasn't sure he would win. "My attack on Singapore was a bluff that worked," he explained. "I had 30,000 men and was outnumbered more than 3 to 1. I knew if I had to fight long for Singapore, I would be beaten. That is why the surrender had to be at once. I was very frightened at the time that the British would discover our numerical weakness and lack of supplies and force me into disastrous street fighting." The bluff worked. The British surrendered a week later. Life in Singapore became extraordinarily difficult. The Japanese harassed, arrested, and tortured many people, especially the Chinese. The invaders also executed anyone they suspected of helping the British. In August 1945, Japan surrendered. British forces soon returned to Singapore. Their return did not end the hardships. Prices rose and food was scarce. These conditions led to labor actions like strikes, with workers walking off their jobs in protest. Newly formed political groups demanded better treatment for workers and independence for Singapore. Both the Singapore Labour Party and the Singapore Progressive Party claimed they could achieve these goals, but the People's Action Party, or PAP, succeeded. Founded by Singapore lawyer Lee Kuan Yew in 1934, it became the winning party in the 1959 elections. That year, Yew was elected Prime Minister of Singapore. It was allowed internal self-government, but the British remained in control of defense and foreign affairs. In September 1963, Singapore joined the Federation of Malaysia. Most Singaporeans, including Yew, believed their survival depended upon this union. Unfortunately, the two countries often had disputes over economic and political issues. Malaysia was also concerned that while most Malaysians were Malay, the majority of Singaporeans, including Yew, had Chinese origins. When the PAP became active in Malaysia, the country asked Singapore to exit the federation. On August 9, 1965, Yew went on national television to announce that Singapore was completely independent. This was not a joyous occasion. Indeed, Yew began to cry as he made this announcement. Like most people then, he did not believe this tiny island nation could survive on its own. Chapter 6. Celebrate. Although modern Singapore is a diverse nation of many cultures, the country's main ethnic groups have many things in common. Chinese, Indian, and Malay cultures all celebrate the strength of family and the value of worship. Chinese are predominantly Tao or Buddhist. Buddhism's core belief is that happiness can only be achieved by eliminating desire. Tao is forced on balance. Tao is focused on balance. Hello. Most Indians in Singapore practice Hinduism, a belief system more than 3,000 years old. Many of Singapore's Malays are Muslims who follow the teachings of the Prophet Muhammad, while Christianity has been practiced since the arrival of the British in the 1800s. Freedom of religion is guaranteed by Singapore's constitution. Although Jehovah's Witnesses were banned in 1972 because their members avoided the country's required military service, not only are most religions welcomed in Singapore, but also all of the country's main religions are included amongst the country's 10 national holidays. The first holiday of the year, New Year's Day, includes everyone. New Year's Eve is celebrated with fireworks over the city's Marina Bay, while New Year's Day is welcomed with worship services and buffets at most major hotels. For the city's many Chinese residents, the New Year doesn't begin until the Chinese New Year. This celebration marks the beginning of the Lunar New Year. It arrives each year in late January to early February with parades of stilt walkers, lion dancers, and floats along Orchard Road. Chinese families celebrate by giving children red envelopes stuffed with money while forgiving those who owe them. In January, 2 Hindu celebrations take place. One is the Feast of Pongal, which means overflow in Tamil. This festival is celebrated with food offerings like sugar, rice, and milk at the Sri Srinivasa Perumal temple. The other, the Thaipusam, is more of a visual feast. Visitors and Hindus alike can watch the Hindu faithful who parade outside of the temple with complex steel arches piercing their skin. Some even pierce their tongues and cheeks with hooks, which are hung with fruit. The main Buddhist holiday, Vesak Day, honors Buddha's birth and falls on the full moon of the month of Visakha, which is April to May. The faithful chant prayers at Buddhist temples, perform acts of kindness, and release caged birds in celebration. The summer offers a variety of entertainments. In July, the Dragon Boat Festival features boats with 22 paddlers from all over the world. Their boats are decorated by a dragon's head and tail. They compete in races honoring Chinese scholar Ku Yan, who drowned himself to protest political corruption. August 9th is Singapore National Day. On this holiday, the country's independence is celebrated with a huge show at the National Stadium that features military parades and fireworks. August, and sometimes September, also features the Chinese Festival of the Hungry Ghosts. Red candles and paper money are burned outside of Chinese homes to appease the souls of the dead released from purgatory during the 7th lunar month. Late September to early October brings another painful holiday with the birthday of the monkey god. Celebrated by Singapore's Taoists, the day honors the monkey god, who managed to sneak into heaven and gain magical powers. He's believed to cure the sick. Taoist monks honor him by going into a trance during which they are entered by his spirit. They then howl and cut themselves with knives. Puppet shows and Chinese operas are also performed. Late in the year, in November or December, Muslims celebrate Hari Raya Haji. This honors one of the 5 pillars of Islam, making the Hajj, the required once-in-a-lifetime journey to the Saudi Arabian city of Mecca. After making the trip, Muslim men have the title of Haji, while Muslim women earn the title of Hajjah. Following morning prayers on this holiday, which takes place on the last day of the Hajj, goats and sheep are sacrificed with the meat given to the poor. It serves as a reminder for the faithful to share their wealth. Christians in Singapore celebrate Christmas on December 25th. Much of the city celebrates the holiday with traditional songs, while many of the city's malls are decorated with festive lights, which have been put up several weeks earlier. I'm going to skip this chapter about Singapore people so we can get to the Singapore Today conclusion. Singapore is more than just a successful port. It's an island filled with successful people. There are more millionaires per capita in Singapore than anywhere else in the world. Even public servants like government administrators earn large salaries. As Wall Street Journal writer Shibani Matani observes, looking for millionaires? Take a drive around Singapore's residential districts. More than 1 in 6 houses you see will be inhabited by one. Singapore had 188,000 millionaire households in 2011, or slightly more than 17% of its resident households. Not only are so many Singaporeans wealthy, they built their fortunes in a hurry. As Malminderjeet Singh of the Business Times points out, if you are looking to getting rich quickly, then being in Singapore is your best bet to do so. The latest report in the Barclays Wealth Insights series shows the wealthy in Singapore took the least time to build their riches, with more than half of them, or 51%, doing it in less than 10 years. In the beginning, when the country split off from Malaysia, even Lee Kuan Yew had his doubts about the chances of his country's ultimate success. I had to make it work or we'd all die, he told author Dan Buettner. This little island with no resources had to survive. We had to be of relevance to the world. That relevance was economics. Our efficiency, our ability to provide a base for secure production, commerce services, transportation of people and goods in every possible way. Lee believes more outsiders failed to notice Singapore's best feature. We had the advantage first of an immigrant population, he explained to Buettner. They have left their secure moorings, China, India, Indonesia, and they have come here to make good. So they are more willing to change than people in their own countries. And change they did. As Prime Minister, Lee led a government which demanded extraordinary changes from its people. The choices he made helped ensure his nation's survival. Some say they also severely limited people's freedom. In the 1960s, the country was a land of contrasts. Very rich people lived in lavish homes while the poor struggled to survive and went home into decaying shacks. The government created the Housing and Development Board. Under its leadership, numerous homes, whether they were in disrepair or not, were torn down in the 1960s and 1970s and replaced by high-rises. These large apartment buildings are subsidized, or partly paid for by the government. Today, 85% of the country's population lives in one of these homes. As the city expanded beyond its original borders, there was very little land available for those who wished to live in a non-government home. This makes them expensive. A 500-square-foot studio condo can cost over $1 million. You inherited a landscape altered by over a century of development. Long before most cities in the U.S. required residential and commercial developers to set aside land for parks, Singapore in the 1960s made sure that parks were created alongside high-rises. Although Singapore's air quality has improved, it is often polluted by nearby countries with fewer restrictions. Forest fires in Indonesia deliberately set by logging and plantation companies have blown smoke across Singapore, causing extraordinary levels of pollution. This is one reason why the government has promoted public transit. In 1990, the first 2 lines of Singapore's mass rapid transit opened. Today, the SMRT trains offer regular stops, with most trains arriving every 6 minutes during peak travel times. To increase the appeal of public transit, the government makes owning a car very expensive. Buying a car in Singapore means paying extraordinarily high taxes. Because of these taxes, relatively few Singaporeans own their own cars. I'm having second thoughts about buying a car, said Stefan Ritzmann, a Swiss executive at a local luxury watch retailer who moved to Singapore not long ago. In Switzerland, cars cost less than half of what they cost here. The government wants us to use public transport, and it works pretty well. After Singapore's independence, the government also became more involved with schooling. It began setting educational standards. The city was predominantly Chinese. Many in this community, including the Chinese Chamber of Commerce, believed Chinese should be the national language. Lee refused. He'd seen how Malaysia had suffered by making Malay its national language. He wanted his people fluent in a language that was widely spoken, especially by people in the wealthy countries he hoped would conduct business in Singapore. He also did not want to select the first language of most Singaporeans, so he chose the language spoken by the country's colonial rulers. We decided to keep English and also teach each group's mother tongue, Chinese, Mandarin, Malay, whatever, he explained. That gave us an enormous advantage. Having all children learn one common language, regardless of their race or ethnic background, did more than help to prepare them for jobs. It also forged a national identity. Today, it doesn't matter where a person comes from. Anyone who attends school in Singapore speaks English along with their native language. Today, half of Singaporeans are literate, able to read and write in 2 languages. This was one more way Singaporeans prepared for the 21st century. An educated, English-speaking workforce and a very low rate of taxation to foreign businesses and their workers have helped Singapore attract a number of companies that set up manufacturing plants and corporate headquarters. In addition to adopting English, Singapore also adopted the government structure of its one-time colonial administrator. Both Singapore and Great Britain have a parliament and a prime minister. In Singapore, 87 members of parliament are elected by the people. Up to a dozen more are chosen by a select parliamentary committee. The prime minister is responsible for the country's operations, while the president is the head of state and chooses the prime minister. Although there were candidates from other political parties, between 1968 and 1981, there was not a single non-PAP member in Parliament. PAP has held the majority of the Parliament seats since then. PAP has always won both the presidency, and a party member has been Prime Minister. The most public face of the new Singapore, PAP founder Lee remained Prime Minister for over 30 years. When he stepped down in 1990, he was replaced by Deputy Prime Minister Goh Chok Tong. Elections in Singapore don't always happen as scheduled. In 1999, the Elections Committee disqualified every presidential candidate except Singapore's former ambassador to the United States, S.R. Nathan. The election was cancelled and Nathan became president. In 2005, the committee again disqualified everyone except Nathan, and he became president again. The year before, Lee's son, Lee Hsien Loong, became prime minister. Even if they are presented with very few choices, eligible voters are expected to cast a ballot. Not voting can get a person fined, so can many other things. Singapore is a fine city is a sort of unofficial city slogan. It means it is not only a pleasant place, but also that numerous behaviors will earn a fine. Buying or selling gum is illegal. So is spitting or smoking in public. Serious crimes like drug dealing or possession are punished by death. People convicted of less serious crimes like vandalism are beaten with a thin rattan cane, usually severely enough to break the skin. As the prime minister for over 3 decades, Lee maintained tight control of his country. Unlike the United States, freedom of the press does not exist in Singapore. News stories must be approved by government officials. They are censored or cut out if the government dislikes them. It is illegal for someone in Singapore to connect a TV to a satellite dish because it could pick up transmissions from outside of the country. The internet is carefully regulated, and many popular websites are unavailable. Lee is unapologetic. He believes the laws of his country have helped it become one of the safest cities in the world, a place where most people feel comfortable walking home alone after dark. The laws against bribery and fraud also have helped Singapore earn a top spot among the least corrupt countries in the world. Despite the planning and organization, even Singapore has endured economic challenges. For decades, the country has a growth rate of 7 to 9%. In 2003, travel to Southeast Asia was greatly reduced because of an outbreak of severe acute respiratory syndrome, or SARS. This disease was highly contagious and sometimes fatal. The nation's economy contracted by more than 11%. The global economic crisis of 2008 to 2009, like the Great Depression, had a huge impact on Singapore. The country's growth again declined, dropping as much as 5%. The government provided a multi-billion-dollar stimulus package. New casinos and international theme parks, along with a redeveloped marina, were built to attract more visitors. Despite these and other challenges, Singapore faces the new millennium's second decade uniquely well prepared to continue its success story. It's kind of an older book, as you can tell, but a good one, I think. I really liked those chapters about the history. I liked how they combined the modern Singapore with the history. I really liked it. This kid is so cute. Anyway, thank you for watching. I hope you found this video relaxing and educational. And I hope that you have a very good night. Good night.